I realized later it was strength that Nike responded to, not weakness. And I needed to show up with confidence and with strength and meet them as, if not peers, at least someone who had a platform to stand on. And I discovered that it was when I took up that stance that I was taken the most seriously.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Shannon Rowbury. Shannon is a 3-time Olympian in track and field. She's a world record holder, a medalist. For 10 years, she was in the top 10 of her sport. She spent her career expanding the idea of what it means to be an athlete, particularly as a woman. In our conversation, we talk about gender and negotiation, particularly for women athletes. We talk about her 20-year relationship with Nike and some of the ups and downs there. We talk about teammates and how men and women negotiate differently with each other. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. Shannon Rowbury, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, good to see you, Stan. Thanks for having me join you.
Absolutely. I've been excited about this. You are a real live professional athlete, one of the few that could make money doing the thing you loved. Give us a sense of what it's like to be a professional athlete.
It's a lot of grind and hard work. It's very exacting odds. I was doing the research. Making one Olympic team is 1 in a million odds, and making 3 Olympic teams is maybe around 1 in 10 million. So I'm glad I didn't know the stats beforehand, but that thrill of competition and those good races is what keeps you going. There's a lot of time that you need to be kept going in between, but that high is really quite motivating.
Did you have a sense that you could do this professionally? I mean, presumably you came up through high school and college, but when did you have that sense that you could make this your full-time thing and do it professionally?
Yeah, I didn't realize professional running was a career option. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I had sports icons that I was inspired by, but they all played basketball, baseball, football, and they were all boys. And so sports was really cool, but it wasn't ever a dream of mine. And, the Olympics would come on every 4 years, but that seemed like an isolated thing. It didn't seem like it could be a career path. So I started running in high school, and I'd been told I was fast. I just wanted to be the best on my team to start. But what I've discovered for me is, I just always keep trying to be the best at the level I'm at. And that achievement at each level then sort of sets the bar a little higher. And ultimately, I got a college scholarship. That became the goal in high school, get a college scholarship. So I went to Duke on an athletic scholarship. Then it became, okay, can I be the best in the NCAA? And I did that by my senior year. And then it suddenly was, oh, well, maybe this professional running thing that's actually a job I could do, and I can travel the world doing it. And so it wasn't until probably senior year of college that I started to think maybe that was a possibility for me.
So Shannon, you had a 20-year relationship with Nike. You must have done some things right there that listeners could learn from. When you started out, you didn't have 3 Olympics behind you. You were a young athlete with promise. So how did you negotiate those initial contracts, and how did it lead to a long-term relationship?
First, I had to deliver on that promise. I got a contract on my potential, and I needed to make an Olympic team. I needed to medal in order to prove that was more than potential, that I actually could deliver. And long term, I needed to think about my relationship with the company over the long term with the assumption that it would be a long contract. And in doing so, carry myself with professionalism, understand what, my bosses needed to deliver to their bosses. And so when it came to pregnancy, I needed to do my research, figure out what I could deliver on the contract that I had, what I couldn't. I needed to proactively communicate that with them and show the value that I could add, even though I wasn't competing, and how I had paid attention to the details. And also understand more broadly that, while my bosses wanted to deliver medals, they also worked at a publicly traded company, and perception was important. And that I needed to make sure that they understood that I had done things right and I had a strong case for myself, so that they would take me seriously.
Sounds like you really did a good job of holding your ground while building the relationship. I know lots of athletes, kind of burn the house down, and Nike famously has fired some very prominent athletes when they got into too much friction. You were able to negotiate from a position of strength and focus on the long-term relationship. And I think that must be part of what contributed to you having such a successful relationship with them.
Yeah, I realized later it was strength that Nike responded to, not weakness. And I needed to show up with confidence and with strength and meet them as, if not peers, at least someone who had a platform to stand on. And I discovered that it was when I took up that stance that I was taken the most seriously. Yeah, so I spent a decade top 10 in the world. I had American records in the 1500, the 2 mile, and the 5K. My 1500 meter American record, and actually area record, so North, Central, and South American record, was 356, which converts to about a 413 for the mile. And it was a record that had stood for, I think, longer than I'd been alive at that point, over 30 years. It was an accomplishment I was really very proud of. I think when you look at that athlete space, though, it is very much a kind of, we love to build up these athletes and we want to see them achieve things. But as soon as they do them, it's what will you do for me next? What have you done for me lately? And that constant need to deliver and kind of level up, even if the level you're at is already very high.
So just wrapping up on that initial shoe contract, did your agent play a role? Did you feel well represented in that deal?
My first agent was, someone who I had met him. He lived in San Francisco as well, had gone to my high school coach's high school also, had followed my athletic career. So I felt like there was a lot of strong connections. And, I was grateful for the work they did. That being said, I think it's important for everyone to understand that those agents also have their business that they're developing. And it took me a bit to kind of understand when it came to negotiation, if an agent is representing multiple people and is trying to negotiate those shoe contracts, because the primary contracts in track and field are shoe contracts, and the shoe companies with a lot of money to pay athletes is a smaller pool. And so that agent is trying to balance representing that athlete as best they can, hopefully, but also maintaining relationships with those shoe companies so that they can negotiate for other athletes as well. And it is a small group of people that, everybody knows each other in track and field, as is the case with a lot of industries, right? The key players, everybody knows each other. And so, I don't want to make a judgment either way on whether they represented me as best they could or not. But I did come to discover throughout my career that I needed to be an advocate for myself as well, I guess is maybe the best way to say it, because ultimately at the end of the day, I was my number one priority, but that wasn't the case for those representing me.
Interesting. So what would your advice be to young athletes now going in? I'm sure it's the same dynamic. There aren't that many more shoe companies, and there are only so many athletes that are going to be sponsored. So you have, we call in negotiation a principal agent problem, where your incentives aren't necessarily aligned, and you did a nice job of outlining that. What would your advice be to a young athlete in search of an agent that would represent them and advocate for them and be on their side?
I think we're in a much different situation than I was in 2007 in that we do have these social media platforms. We do have these mechanisms for athletes to show their personality beyond the field of play. I felt very limited in my professional athletic career in that, while I was competing, the mandate for the department that managed my contract was medals. And that was what they were kind of graded on. And as a result, their investment, their decisions were all based on making sure that the athletes they signed were getting medals, had the most medal potential. What that lost sight of was what the athlete could deliver beyond the field of play. And if you don't have a company strategy to leverage that, then medals are all that matter. I think for our athletes who can share the causes that are important to them, who can connect with fans in a way that's self-led, they have this opportunity to really prove their value through that engagement and to, advocate for themselves based on those numbers and those statistics, realizing that this is a business. And if you want to succeed in that business, you have to understand what those kind of key metrics are for that person who's going to be paying you at the end of the day. I think that the companies themselves, the shoe companies themselves, have started to do a better job of shifting in that regard and leveraging that athlete's story, working with that athlete to tell their story and connect with fans and consumers. I think there's still work to be done, but I would say for those athletes out there is really figuring out ways to tell their story, to connect with fans. Obviously, operation critical, deliver where you're supposed to deliver, perform when you need to perform. But if you can be more well-rounded, be more broadly engaging, I think that sets you up for, it gives you a stronger case when it comes to negotiating for yourself.
Interesting. You've been such a good advocate for women athletes, and I want to talk quite a bit about that. Are there unique challenges as a woman? Nike, I've only, paid attention to the popular media, but they've certainly had their ups and downs on how they deal with women. Tell a little bit about that perspective. Tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a woman athlete, how Nike dealt with women athletes, and what we could learn from a negotiation perspective on that.
So there's been a big shift there as well in, I would say about 2019, where there were a series of New York Times articles really highlighting, in the most generous way of describing it, a massive blind spot when it came to the treatment of the women within, yes, within Nike, but really more broadly within sports. And so while Nike was the one that got the most headlines, the reality is that across sports, we were operating in an environment that had been created for this archetype of athlete, which was sort of that Greek male Adonis, millennia old, right? And women in professional sports with professional sport contracts are new. It's recent. But by the, 20 teens, there were multiple women who had, been able to make successful careers for themselves. In a lot of instances, were the primary earners and were finding themselves in this kind of impossible situation of deciding between, do I want to have a family or do I want to continue my career? So it was a really dark place for me, especially because, the idea of being a mom is something that I dreamed of far before I ever wanted to be a professional athlete. And so, for me, that was 2017, 2018. It really became, with my back against the wall, I had no other choice but to figure out what to do, kind of this call to action and figuring out how to, make the sport a little bit more up to date.
Wow, that seems like just such a tough decision. As a man, it's impossible to get into your shoes and know what that feels like. In my research for this podcast, so that was 2017, 2019, things kind of blew up for Nike in terms of gender. There's a lot of stuff in the media about you and Allison Felix, your teammate, going to battle with Nike. So the way you framed it sounded great, but now they're having gender problems. So how did Nike do here, and how did you negotiate with them?
So when I was working through my contract, it was about 6 months prior. And I wish I could say that things had moved faster and that those big kind of public revelations hadn't had to come to be. And it was really my friend Alicia Montano and Allison Felix who were the public face of that. I took an approach of really trying to be strategic about how I documented the work that I had done, how I communicated it with people who were decision makers, all with the goal of keeping a seat at the table. And, because of the media coverage in 2019, there became across the industry of sports an awareness, a wake-up call that things needed to shift. And that's when we started to see company after company institute maternity policies where they had not previously been. And, the legislation that we created for USA Track and Field became a really important tool to reference when it was, okay, what would be a fair first step? But it is exciting to see the shifts that have been made. It has been a lot of hard moments. I'll speak for myself, a lot of hard moments, a lot of tears, a lot of frustration, but keeping myself forward thinking in terms of, what can I do? What this athlete concept, how do I control the controllables? How do I continue to affect change where I can have influence, how to keep building that community of advocates and allies to, to modernize sport, really.
So Shannon, what would your advice be to women who want to have a big career like you did, but also want to have a family and want to have children? How do you balance that? What would your advice be there?
I would say you should think about it early, and you should be strategic in the way you think about parenthood, just like you are strategic about your career trajectory. I knew I wanted to be a mom before I ever wanted to be a professional athlete. But as a professional athlete, I knew that it would have a huge implication on my performance. And so I waited until my 30s to have my family. When you're thinking about your career in the workplace, think about, do I want to be in a startup or a corporate environment? What maternity protections will I have? What health insurance? What workload might I be undertaking? And thinking about your resume as a body of work, knowing that motherhood is a hugely important phase of life for the people who choose to take it on, but it will create a couple years of reduced effectiveness because if you're engaged in that child's life, it is very consuming. And so understanding the dynamics of motherhood in context of your career goals and making choices about, as much as you can about when you have your family, because it is a big shift.
So I presume that most of the people you negotiate with at U.S. Track and Field and at Nike were men. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes.
And so you not only succeeded at a difficult thing, but you did it with men. What about with women? One thing you hear frequently, and I don't know what the research says on this, is women are sometimes reluctant to help each other and bootstrap each other up. Did you find that you negotiated differently with men and women?
Definitely. I would say that, with my female teammates, it was a lot more passive aggressive, things unsaid, and needing to figure out how to strengthen those relationships or have those conversations to build community, because community is really important within a woman's team. And on the men's side, it was much more frequent that you would have a fight. Sometimes, punches are thrown, not to the women, but to each other. And then the boys would go have a beer. It was something we would laugh about. But the reality is that the two react to situations differently, and understanding that is important when you're thinking about how you want to communicate what you need to share.
What about coaches? What about male versus female coaches?
Well, I've only ever had male coaches, but it was important to understand how they operated. So as a boss, there was one of my coaches if I were to push too hard, he would always throw a grenade. So I needed to figure out how to kind of talk around the issue to ultimately kind of convince without actually going straight in. Whereas I had another coach later who was much more collaborative, and he was very receptive to the information that I shared. So understanding those personality types, how alpha do they need to be? And then, figuring out how to get your point across and ultimately get what you want, but what are the delivery mechanisms that'll get you there?
That reminds me of, there's a coach of the North Carolina men's and women's soccer team. So initially he was the men's coach and won a lot of national championships. Then he went to become the women's coach. And what he learned, and I'll attach a link in the notes about this for a YouTube video, is that you have to coach women differently. That with men, he could say to them, "You're wrong. You're doing it wrong." You could punish them. And women, if you did that, they would just fold. Where what women you needed to do is show them the videos of when they did a great job and be very affirming. And so I just think, men and women probably coach differently and need to be coached differently. Is that fair to say? You
tell a women's team to do something, and it's more about telling them how much is enough and where they need to stop, because at least at Duke, if we were given a task, everybody would over deliver on it. Whereas a men's team, you might need to police them a bit more. And criticism to a woman could be internalized much more easily than on the men's side. So you're very much right in that. What I have observed and experienced is that need to understand the way that we operate, and meeting, just like I needed to negotiate with my coach based on that person's personality, understanding some of those team dynamics of each gender and acting in the corresponding way.
Just kind of curious, I want to jump just for a minute to your current business career. In a business setting, do you find that you negotiate differently with men than you negotiate with women?
I do. I find for men, I need to lead a bit more with my accomplishments because those statistics give me credibility and help me be seen as a peer and show the value that I can add. Whereas if it's a room full of women or I'm negotiating with women, it's important that I show my credibility and my strength, but not too much. I need to make sure that there's an understanding that we can work collaboratively and as a community. Otherwise, an excessive show of my accomplishments might feel off-putting or too showing. And so definitely when it comes to the two, a difference in how I play up or play down the accomplishments that I have.
Okay. Let's shift to a controversial topic in your sport, which is doping. You received a bronze medal that ended up coming to you, and again, congratulations. They're just, as you mentioned, are almost nobody ever medals in the Olympics statistically. So you're just part of this elite group. Part of how you got that is someone got disqualified. Talk a little bit about that. Just give listeners, because most of us aren't that aware of, we hear things like, well, the Russians dope, but no one else does. Just give us an overview of prevalence of doping, how that affected you. Did you feel pressure to dope? And how did you kind of walk that line and make those moral judgments?
Yeah. Luckily, I started professional sports with the conviction that I would rather quit than cheat. I didn't realize, I was very naive. I thought that it was a small group of people that wanted to break the rules. And I realized that like any business, like anything where there's money and pride on the line, there's some people who are willing to do it the wrong way. And the London Olympics 2012 1500 has kind of notoriously been called the dirtiest race in Olympic history. In that race where I crossed the finish line in sixth, gosh, I'd have to check the stats. It's like 6 or 7 women have been disqualified for doping. Of the 12 finishers, I think 9 have served doping bans at some point in their career. It was a big wake-up call for me coming out of that race that it was so prevalent in the sport. And yet I always knew I wanted to have a family. I always knew that my kind of legacy and reputation and integrity were of the utmost importance to me. And it was never a choice I considered. It was heartbreaking to see that those who cheated were getting ahead and to feel like, doing it the right way. Just, ultimately I did quit in 2021 because I just couldn't keep getting up for a fight that felt, where it felt like just all the odds were stacked against me. But as I was mentioning, if you understand that the work you put out there day in, day out is part of that legacy you're building. And, right now, this career I have is built upon my achievements as an athlete. And I can stand confident in those achievements knowing I did it the right way. I think if you take a look at the long game and you're really conscious of kind of this legacy you want to build and the long-term impact, it at least gives solace. It helped me keep my choices very clear. But you do have to accept that there are going to be those people that try to do it the wrong way, and you just have to, figure out how to bring your best. And I mean, I certainly beat a lot of cheaters without cheating, so it is possible, but it isn't necessarily easy.
You say that part of the reason you quit in 2021 was essentially people had unfair advantages through doping. Is that particular to certain countries like Russia, or does the U.S. team have problems with that as well?
I think anywhere where there's pride and money, people cheat. I think the United States, USADA, U.S. Anti-Doping, and Travis Tygart, who's the leader of it, are very committed to clean sport. And so, if you have leadership within your country, and WADA is World Anti-Doping. So as an American athlete, I was when I was competing, I was in the global testing pool, And I needed to report my location every day, where I was sleeping. I needed to provide a 1-hour window where I would guarantee to be found if they wanted to come test me. And I also needed to report, if I was traveling, where I was training. There was a lot of, it was a lot of effort to comply with those rules of being in the testing pool. That being said, I was willing to and willingly complied because it's important to me for clean sport. As a U.S. athlete with both USADA and WADA, the likelihood of being tested is a lot higher. You compare that to some countries that historically haven't had a national testing body like Kenya or Ethiopia, where only WADA is coming in, and the resources required for WADA to send in a team to go through customs to bring in all of their testing tools. You look at Russia, which unfortunately had RUSADA, which turned out to be not an anti-doping program, but a federally funded doping program. The athlete Tomashova, who was caught in my race, was part of that. And so there was unfortunately corruption taking place. And it wasn't just in the doping control. It was also when I was competing, the president of IAAF, it's now called World Athletics, but our global governing for sport of track and field, Lemane Diak, was found to be completely corrupt. His sons were involved in taking bribes to cover up doping bans. So, when you look at London 2012 and what took place there, in retrospect, it's clear it was sort of this distillation of everything that was going wrong, the corruption that was taking place in leadership. And fortunately, with our new president, Seb Coe, with an athlete integrity unit, which was an independent body set up to try to maintain integrity in sport, and leadership that seems to actually want clean sport, it does feel like it's shifting in a better direction. But unfortunately, we had several years of, people in positions of authority that were doing the exact opposite of what their mandate was.
It's hard. Well, let's talk a little bit about 2021. You retired, and you're still young. You got lots of time, and you've started a business. And one of the things that I said recently on a podcast episode was that of all the people I've hired, there are two categories of people that stand out. One is former athletes, and two is former military, for similar reasons. There's a lot of structure in both of those areas. There's a lot of competitiveness. So talk about lessons from sport that apply to your business career, and just give us some highlights and stories of what you're doing and what lessons, particularly as they apply to negotiation and persuasion.
Yeah. So 2021, I stopped competing. It was, even though intellectually, that your career will come to an end, every athlete has sort of this expiration date over their head. And I felt like I'm going to be so prepared for it. I have a good education. I've had a long career, but that shift is still really emotional when you're used to competing on these very clear metrics with a very clear goal. And suddenly that's over. That thrill of performance is over, and you need to carve out your own path. It's really emotional. And it took me some time to kind of reorient and recalibrate. And I was doing a lot of independent consulting with businesses, speaking about my athlete experience and performance. But it took me a couple years to really collect all of that information, have some lived experience in that transition to be able to distill down those athlete traits into something that was more relatable, more kind of digestible for just potential people that might want to work with me. But then also I found this opportunity to deliver it more broadly. And so Lauren Gibbs, who's a bobsled silver medalist, and we worked together at a sports tech startup. When we stopped working there, we ultimately worked together to create this concept called medalist mindset, which takes athlete sports performance tools and translates them into business and life goal achievement. It's been fun because what we had observed, to your point, there were a lot of performance tools that were informed by military veterans, also a lot of performance and leadership tools designed by academics, but not as many that had come from that sports experience. And part of that is because sports performance is kind of a newer tool. It was a really valuable process of taking all of those tools, distilling them down, making it into a step-by-step process so that we could present it to others in a way that was digestible, actionable, and not just talking about what they needed to do, but creating worksheets and kind of action-oriented ways that they could begin to integrate those athlete sports performance tools into their lives.
Wow. Those are lucky clients. You get all the benefit of the years of your experience. And just tell us quickly the name of that business, or maybe people that listen to this podcast that would love to get in touch with you. And so just do a little commercial for yourself.
Oh, okay. Medalist Mindset is the philosophy that Lauren Gibbs and I created. My business partner, Bob West, we have West Strategy Group. Bob has spent about 30 years in cybersecurity. So a lot of our early clients have been in cyber. But I've had the privilege of working with companies across the board, from global pharmaceuticals to global banks, sports tech, cyber, all kinds of things, because the performance is performance. I mean, you know this, it's these human traits, and achievement at the highest levels takes these certain tools, but it is fun to create a kind of a unique perspective on performance.
Great. We'll put a link to your organization if anyone wants to get a hold of you. We'll make that easy for them. Let's finish up. We're running out of time, which does not surprise me. There's so many things that are fun to talk to you about. But let's just kind of do a lightning round. And conversations that you and I have had in the past, I've learned a lot about you, and I just want the listeners to know you better. Interesting to me is that your husband's also a professional athlete. Two very high-powered people. How do you guys negotiate with each other?
So my husband's from Mexico. Our earliest challenges were communication. There's just fundamentally the language difference. And so I'll never forget one of our first fights. I had jokingly called him a butthead, but he thought I was calling him something a lot harsher. And he was so mad at me. And then we had to explain the intent. I think for us, there's a lot that doesn't need to be said because we've lived the same experiences. We've had the same coach. And at the same time, there's a lot that's different because we grew up in two completely different cultures. And so I think I have this deep trust and respect for him. A lot of our negotiations are just understanding the deeper motivations when it comes to, some of these cultural differences that drive me in a way that's different from what drives him, but this love and respect for one another, and trying to figure out, okay, what's the middle ground that can enable us both to feel fulfilled, to have, that balance in when I'm pushing and he covers, that the script can be flipped so it's not ever too far one way or the other. But I would say that those negotiations a lot of times are just that deeper understanding of why does this matter to you, and how can I wrap my head around it so that I can be a better supporter, vice versa.
The Mexican culture, I've spent a lot of time in Mexico and negotiate a lot with people from Mexico. And I find some really beautiful things about that culture that would relate to families. And I want to see if this is true in your life. One is it's an incredibly relational culture. You can't have too many friends. You can't spend too much time with your family. Dinners can't be, too long. They're much less transactional than we are. Has that been your experience?
Absolutely. I grew up in San Francisco, but I'm an Irish by origin. And, what's so cool is on the surface, I don't know that I ever would have expected that the Irish and the Mexican are so similar, but that is deeply important to my family as well. Those relationships, that kind of clan mentality. And that if you have, I would say, my circle isn't as broad, partly because of life, but the people that are in my circle, I'm deeply committed to. And those relationships are extremely important.
Shannon, who's been the most persuasive person in your life?
It was fun. While we were prepping, I thought a lot about it. And there's a story I think it's fun to share about my mom and how I think she really set me up. We talked about, advocating for oneself, the career that I've had. I remember I must have been 4 or 5, and we were getting ready to go to school. We stopped by a bakery in the morning, and my mom would encourage me to, go stand in line and here's the money and you can go buy the croissant. And one morning I was standing in line and someone came in the shop and seeing a little kid assumed that I must not be in line and just went right in front of me. And I remember feeling so frustrated, so surprised because that wasn't fair. And I looked at my mom and she sort of kind of came over and said, tell him you were next. I'm 4 or 5 and this gentleman is a grown man, maybe came to his hips if even, but she just calmly said, tell him you're next. And I remember speaking up, saying to him, excuse me, I'm next, in my squeaky little kid voice. And it felt like the entire shop stopped and looked at me. But I got my place back in line and it was such a little thing, but I remember it 35 years later. I think it's those lessons about how we show up in the world, how we stand up for ourselves, how we don't pick every battle, but we pick the important ones. And at that point, as a little kid, understanding that space I took up was mine and I had every right to own it. And so, I don't know if that's persuasion so much, but it was certainly a fundamental lesson in how to use my voice, use my presence to move forward with confidence and accomplishment. And that motto has sort of taken me on the path that has brought me here.
It's a beautiful story and a nice place to end. Shannon, thanks so much for spending time with me today on the podcast, and good luck in all your negotiations.
Thanks, Stan.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. Please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend, and be sure to engage with us on social media. Your likes, comments, and reposts make a big difference and help others find the show. The show was produced by Ezra Trupiano, original music by Peter Breinhold, and designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.